Melissa. I
Oh,
don't.
sorry, Melissa's right here. Also in turn. I'll get her to
Okay.
come down.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And you're good. Your mic is not up, so you're more than welcome. Yes.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure. My name is Maxwell Young. I'm the Director of Communications for 1863 Ventures. Thank you for being here on a rainy Thursday. The holiday's approaching, so I know how much work takes a back seat at times like this, but still it's a pleasure to see wonderful faces here in this room and people who I don't know, but I look forward to getting to know. But we appreciate you for engaging with 1863 today for our town hall. We're here to talk about the state of entrepreneurship for Black and brown founders. At 1863, we call these founders the new majority. Oftentimes, these are founders coming from underrepresented, underprivileged, marginalized communities. We're talking about the Black community, the Latino community, the LGBTQ community as well. In 1863, the work that we do revolves around them with business development training, with funding opportunities, with mentorship. And so the people who are in this audience today who've engaged with us in some of these capacities, we're very appreciative that you're here, and we're glad of the relationship that we have, and we look forward to the future. It's a future of prosperity, and you very much play a role in that. Today, we have esteemed guests. We have policy leaders. We have ecosystem builders. We have Melissa Bradley herself. And so I would like to pass the floor off to Patrice Green from Surdna Foundation, who is here to give remarks. Surdna Foundation is one of our sponsors of the town hall, of our research that we'll be talking about today. We are appreciative of Patrice being here. She's engaged with 1863 in a number of capacities, and so it's just, another day at the office with Patrice. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxwell. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my joy, my honor, and my pleasure to be here representing the Surdna Foundation. Again, my name is Patrice Green, and I am the director of the Inclusive Economies program. And at Surdna, our mission is to foster just and sustainable communities across the U.S. with a focus on how do we create a democracy that is fully participatory for communities of color. How do we create a system of accountability in public and private institutions? And how do we support wealth creation for those communities? And so my program doubles down on what it means to be focusing on that tier of wealth creation. And we're looking to close the racial wealth gap, honoring and supporting entrepreneurship as one of those key pillars to do just that. And so the work of 1863 Ventures and this research on Beyond 5 is critical to that opportunity. And part of what it does for us is how do we get very clear and tell the true story of what it means for new majority entrepreneurs to be doing this work in the 21st century. What do they need? What is truly happening each and every day? Because the reality is these entrepreneurs are still building businesses at higher rates than most folks and still pushing. And part of what we're going to see is that doing it faster, longer, and further with less. And so how do we get really honest about decoupling what it means to be talking about risk and how that is connected to race, and such that if we actually funded folks fully, what would the world look like? So just truly excited for this continued partnership with 1863, all that this research will enable, and the great work of the entrepreneurs that are continuing to be connected. So thank you, and with that, I think I'm turning straight over to the one and only Melissa Bradley.
Y'all are funny. We need to give a larger round of applause to Patrice, who got off. Well, let me tell you why. Okay, she deserves it because she is, but she just got off a plane from Dubai, right? One of those places that was far away that she should have been laying flat, reclining. So we are deeply grateful for her to be here. My name is Melissa Bradley, and I'm founder and managing partner of 1863 Ventures. I also have the privilege to be a professor at Georgetown University, which has been 9 years. And I'm also a fellow Hoya with some other people in here. I do this work because I was one of these entrepreneurs. I started my first business, which I really wasn't sure what it was, but it evolved into a financial services business because I'm that old. There was no fintech. But what's unique about this building, what's unique about this research is that I started my business here at the Martin Luther King Library. I realized that when I graduated from Georgetown and I went to work for corporate America, for better or for worse, I was selling student loans, that I realized I was selling people into a mound of debt. And we lacked access to credible and culturally competent resources to be able to say, this is how you should manage for these kind of finances. And at the time, Reagan was in office and the economy was all about supply side, and we were not in that equation. And so I decided to start a business and ended up really narrowly focusing on women. Ironically, white women who had kids, who were going through a divorce, who were late 40s and early 50s. And what started as me trying to individually meet with them evolved into a multi-million-dollar business that we ended up selling. But what was interesting is that I didn't know that until about a year in. I went to the SBA. They told me no because I was black, I was a woman, and they didn't know any successful people in financial services. And I couldn't figure out how to get customers. So I used to hold free workshops in the old Martin Luther King. And if people know, that meant I was stepping over some homeless people. I had some homeless people in my sessions, but they were allowed to stay. And it was fascinating. And the first weekend I came, because I did have a full-time job, we had about 5 people. And then the second weekend, we had about 25 people. And then by the 6th weekend, we had about 100 people. And at that point, we had maxed out on the conference room, and they were like, we're going to start charging you because you'll be bringing all these people up in the library. But I say that because it's significant to come back here and, 1, to see the renovation of this amazing building and institution, but 2, to reflect on that was in the late 90s of how far we've come as a community of entrepreneurs of color, and how the focus post-George Floyd has been on us. And while some things are great, some things are still the same. And so the work that we do at 1863 Ventures is really to accelerate new majority entrepreneurs, to de-risk them through capital, through coaching, through community, and through content, to be able to help them become viable, scalable businesses. Our goal is by 2030 to create $100 billion of new wealth by and for new majority entrepreneurs. We're on our way. Thank you, I appreciate that. People say, are you going to make it? I believe we will make it. But even if we don't, the fact that we're even having people think it is possible is already a paradigm shift. And obviously, unfortunately, with the deaths of George Floyd, there's a lot more money coming, so how do we use that? As a professor, though, I've realized that it is great to stand up and talk to people and do content, but it's hard to convince people why it's important that we support this work, because everybody is not Patrice, everybody is not Joe Scantlebury. And so 3 years ago, I decided that meeting a gentleman named Sean Escaffrey, who was at Surdna, and some folks from Living City, saying, you know what, we could do so much more if we had more than just stories, but if we had data to talk about why it's important to invest in what we call the new majority. And so our first research was only supported by Surdna, and we set out to find out about valuation growth amongst Black and brown entrepreneurs. As you can imagine, nobody wanted to share that information. And so we pivoted quickly to not talk about valuation growth, but to talk about barriers to starting and the cost of being a Black or brown entrepreneur. And what's interesting is that while the valuation numbers, as we talked to many LPs, were not where they thought it was going to be, it wasn't their fault. It was because it cost at least $250,000 for a Black or brown entrepreneur to start the same exact business as their white peer. And that's because of both direct and indirect cost. Direct because, having been a bank regulator, it is legal for me to charge you more money than you and less money to you. Not right, not wrong, just possible based on this perception of risk, which is highly subjective, although we quantify it on a regular basis. We also found out that we don't get into programs and lots of other things that lead to that being the floor and not the ceiling. What was interesting, though, was post-George Floyd and post-COVID, everybody, all those stats, all these businesses are failing, and I'm like, I don't know what they're talking about, because folks still calling our office. They still coming in. Folks I know, like Lisa's still up and running, so where did all these businesses go? And there was a phenomenon that I think people did not realize when they were doing this research, is that there was a consistent ebb and flow for many Black entrepreneurs. And the very first program that we did, I remember myself and Ade were working, and we were like, this brother is always late. And I was like, dude, you can't be late. Like, what's the problem? He's like, you don't understand. I'm always trying to be on time, but I'm driving an Uber in between running my business. And so if I get a good fare and it's across to the airport, I'm going to be late. And I was like, all right, I got you, brother. Go ahead and be late. At least if you could call in. But I realized that we oftentimes experience temporal entrepreneurship. We work 1 week at our day job, and then the next week we have all the supplies or whatever it is to do the job the next week. So we report on that. It's significant to say that we lost over 50% of businesses post-COVID, because I don't believe that's true. And so we really then wanted to think about what happens to our businesses that are thriving and surviving, maybe not as thriving as they could, past 5 years, and what could we do to help them? So I'm really excited to be able to share the research that we did. We called it small business survivability. And I should say that as a professor, we did all of our literature review and realized there was only one study that had been done around the survivability of Black businesses, and that was a focus group with 12 people. So that was definitely not enough data to move that along. I say that not because that was wrong, but because the lack of support for research around Black entrepreneurs is real. And so I'm deeply grateful to the funders that we had, because it's more than a notion to have nonpartisan dollars to not drive the story, to let the entrepreneurs' tales really come to fruition. And so what we found, which is probably not going to be surprising to you, is a lot of data that talks about the disparities, but there's some successes in there as well. Before I go on, I want to acknowledge our partners. Surdna and Living Cities are here in the room. M&T Bank, Wells Fargo, and Capital One have also been supporters in this, both financially and non-financially, in terms of looking at survey data, in terms of giving us access to entrepreneurs, so we're deeply grateful. And as you'll see throughout the report, we are very, very pleased and thankful to Santiago Carrillo's support and Living Cities closing the gap work that they have been doing all across cities. The last research we did was nationally, and it was extremely important to recognize that entrepreneurship is not universally supported. And so we really wanted to spend time going into communities and looking both at a national level as well as a local level. So let's talk about what we already know. So we know that post-COVID, right, we had the largest growth of entrepreneurs in the country, which is significant because we had been experiencing a 40-year decline of entrepreneurship amongst white men. And so many researchers say, well, uh-oh, small businesses in America can go out of business. I'm like, no, they're not. You just overlooked an entire swath of people who've been doing this a long time. And we know that when we see these numbers, while we're there in big numbers, our businesses are small. We know that most of them are non-employer firms, and most of them generate less than $100,000. But we know that they're potentially surviving longer because we're seeing them. When people like Lisa and Bernadette, and they fill out their forms, I'm going, these folks have been doing it for a long time, and God bless them. But we see that they've capped out at $1 million, maybe $2 million. If they're lucky, they've capped out between 3 to 5. I think we had a few folks in that first group. But that was it, and it becomes harder and harder for them to get contracts, despite the fact that if you were able to make $1 million in this country building a business, you clearly have something. And so we really wanted to spend time understanding why this happens. And so we focus on providing capital to entrepreneurs, knowing that's a big issue. We know that having business assistants, but not just normal coaching, but culturally competent coaching. And then we also know access to social capital is extremely critical. So when we did this survey, we wanted to understand how these factors, how changing demographics in this country where the new majority is already manifested, but we're not seeing the support coming towards them, where we see increasing input costs of supply chain, tie-ups, transportation costs, inflation now coming, Fed Reserve trying to react. How does that manifest and impact small business? And then obviously thinking about that for many in the Black community, the start of wealth is not the trust fund that was transferred to them. The start of wealth is home ownership and being able to pull out equity and build against that. And that's been a significant factor because the majority of the entrepreneurs that we have seen are maxing out their pension funds. They're emptying out their retirement accounts, which on one hand we say, way to go. On the other hand, I'm going, oh my God, what are we going to do and how are we really preserving wealth? So the focus of this was to really think about how can we help businesses not just survive and thrive, but in an equitable way that they are not sacrificing everything they have that will ultimately diminish the wealth upon having a liquidity event. And so here's what we found. Not surprising, of the thousands of people that we talked to, most of them were African-American women. I know the brothers are right behind us. Most of them were in beauty. People say, well, why are all these Black people in beauty? It's easy access, low barriers to entry. We have soap companies, we have hair care companies, we have facial care companies, easy things that you can access resources in your community, and you can start it in your own home. Surprisingly enough, when we talk about entrepreneurship as a professor, we think it's the young people. But in our community, it's those who spend time in corporate America, who have experience, who have credit, at least before they start their businesses, and who have access to resources in terms of pension funds, IRA, et cetera, to be able to start their business. And not surprising, many of them are parents or heads of households, which is significant because when we think about creating this multiplier effect of wealth, oftentimes, even when there's been a liquidity event, there's nothing to pass them down. One of the drivers of this research and the other research being a venture capitalist is that I was sick and tired of seeing black women come to me with amazing companies, but when you look at the cap table, they were less than 15% after that second round of financing. So thinking about this impact and not having that trickle-down effect of dollars to help wealth in their communities is really important. So what did we find out about them? Well, we found that while the average business fails in 6 years, an average black business lasts at least 8.5 years. So we're lasting longer. What does that say? It means when you say, well, I'm not sure they're going to be around. No, we're going to be around. Why? Because COVID is a daily experience for us. The nation called it COVID. We call it normal lack of access to capital, normal supply chain. It was just a normal experience where they say when the white community catches a cold, we get the flu. And so we're surviving. We're making it. We find that if people have a plan, they're surviving 2.5 times more. And that's extremely important as a guide to ecosystem builders and people who say they want to help entrepreneurs to make sure they're putting the rigor and diligence behind what we're helping them to do. We also know that partnerships are critical, which speaks to the issue of social capital. We know that many of our entrepreneurs have amazing social capital within their community, but it wasn't until I sold my first business that I met my first fellow black CEO. Why is that significant? Not only because I needed to see somebody who looked like me, because the brother was willing to say, let me tell you what I've already learned. It was not how do I gatekeep and keep you out of the system, but how do I help you advance? And so that's a critical piece. We also know, I'm not surprised when we look at the venture capital numbers, that most of them access debt. And what we found in the focus group is that most of them maxed out their credit cards to start with and then began to empty out their IRAs, and some of them even borrowed against their home. So even if they have an exit, we're now saying that it's not coming back to them, it's going to a bunch of third-party servicers who have taken that on. We also know that despite all the money that many of our large institutions are putting in community development financial institutions, they're not banking with them. And so we spent time in the focus group trying to understand why. One, a lot of them didn't know what they were. Two, a lot of them didn't know where they were. And three, some of them said they take too long. And so thinking about knowing that post the PPP crisis where banks just did not come through for us, and it was once the Fed opened up the pipeline to CDFIs, how do we give more prominence and promotion to CDFIs and help increase their capacity to meet the need that is currently not happening? And then one of the challenges that we've seen for years is that we as people of color tend to ask what we think we can get and not what we need, because there is no way in the world that an average loan size of $10,000 is going to help create wealth in any of these businesses. So there's a lot of work to be done. We also found that over half of them use personal credit to start their business, which means that when they try to continue, they're unable to. About 80% of the respondents said that their borrowing on the outset negatively impacted their credit score on the back end. So after they had built these businesses and they had a chance for that J-curve to go up, they had no access to capital because CDFIs would take too long or they didn't know them, banks would not qualify them, and they were maxed out on their credit cards. And now their credit scores were a little too low to be able to be considered. And so they oftentimes found themselves going for hard money. We had an entrepreneur in Chicago that actually was, has anybody heard of Mael Hair Care? Okay, all right, see, I could probably name a bunch, but this sister, Phil Reeves, who used to be with us, met, and she is the scientist behind all that. And so she's making everybody else famous. She had gotten a $250,000 SBA loan. She still needed another $200,000. We realized that she could not become profitable. And I said, let's just fly out and look at your books because something's not right. We realized that she actually less debt was having 20 to 30% margins, but by the time she paid back the hard money and her interest rate, she was negative every single month. And so it was an opportunity to consolidate her loan and actually get her on the path to profitability, and she just purchased her own new building in Chicago. So if you help them and provide that financial planning, we see that they can actually go farther. We know that if they're profitable and they have access to capital, as the story I just shared, they have a greater likelihood of not just surviving but thriving because there is that opportunity for people to invest. And that we understand that if you've done it more than once, you get it right, which is a problem. We can be excited about serial entrepreneurship, but oftentimes when they do it the second time, it's a business that they're not passionate about. It's a business that is not focused on their community. And it's a business that oftentimes is not exactly meeting a community need. And so it's just something to begin to think about. And so we went on to do a lot of other things in this, but I wanted to at least set the stage in terms of what the statistics are, to now have people who are doing this work, to have entrepreneurs, to have ecosystem builders, to have government officials say, what is it that we can do with this? You can access the report on the website where we share all the findings. We also talk about what recommendations are for founders from founders who've been around for 5 years. We have recommendations from these founders for policymakers, both at a local level and a national level. And we certainly have recommendations for ecosystem builders like ourselves who say that we are stewards of the assets and wealth creation for Black and brown businesses, but oftentimes don't do a great job. So with that, I'm going to ask Maxwell to come back up to facilitate a panel with some amazing entrepreneurs who are doing more than just surviving, but thriving as part of this Beyond 5 campaign. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, we're good. Please. Thank you. Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you, Melissa, for sharing about the Beyond 5 data. And the key finding one of my favorite findings about Beyond 5 is the fact that African Americans are surviving longer than the national average, businesses surviving. And that's 8.9 years. And we found that the national average, the businesses are surviving at average for 5 years. And Black-owned businesses are surviving for 8.9 years. The crux of this phenomenon is that while Black businesses are surviving, they're not receiving the access to capital. And so as we're within this challenge, we need to acknowledge the fact that Black-owned businesses, new majority-founded businesses are establishing themselves, are creating enterprises faster than anyone in the nation. That's people in this room. We have some of these founders here on this panel. I'd like to introduce Lisa Deane, Derek Young, and in the middle we have George Williams, who's a gracious guest from the library as well. As we start, I'd love for Derek and Lisa, please to talk a little bit about your business, what you do, and when it was founded, how long you've been in business. Lisa, we'll start with you.
I'm Lisa Deane, and I'm the president of Federal Contractors, Incorporated. We are a general construction company located in D.C. We specialize in architectural and electrical construction. I've worked for the company since 2003 when it was founded, and I actually purchased it in 2015. So I've had ownership for about 7 years.
Derek?
Hello everyone, I'm Derek Young. I am a co-owner, founder of Mahogany Books. We started in 2007. We are a bookstore that sells books that are written for, by, and about people of the African diaspora. We currently have 2 locations. One, our first store is in Southeast DC, my home, and our second location, which we opened last year in National Harbor, International Harbor.
Wonderful. So to be in operation for 5+ years, it requires diligence, perseverance. Talk a little about the challenges that arose when you first started Mahogany Books, Federal Contractors, but even more recently, we're coming out of a pandemic, and that certainly was a period of time where businesses had to pivot and adapt to changes. So if you could talk to us about the changes that sort of arose from the pandemic, but also more importantly, as you were starting your businesses, some of those challenges that you overcame to get to where you are today.
Okay, so like I said, I purchased my company. So some of the challenges I had were to actually make it mine and undo some of the work that had been done before. There was no marketing, there was no business plan. And I kind of jumped head first, and that wasn't a good thing to do. So I had to actually sit back and say, okay, we did exclusively federal work. So when the federal shutdown hit, it hit us hard. So it's okay, I need to diversify my streams of revenue. So we started doing work in DC, DC Department of Employment Services, different agencies, and started doing some private work as well. And that really was when we started taking off. We started networking more, which was something that we had never done. There was no marketing. It was just, do a federal bid and you're over with. But we actually put a marketing plan in place. We were actually going along well until the pandemic hit. So it's like, okay, now we have to rethink this all over again. And even though we were in construction, a lot of people said construction kept going. For a lot of small companies, it didn't. So what we did is we leveraged those agencies and clients that we had, and went to them and said, hey, you know, we have some jobs there on hold, but do you have some small projects you can do? Or do you have some simplified acquisitions, which, you know, is 25,000 below? Do you have some credit card purchases you can do? So we were actually able to get a lot of projects that way between the federal and the DC side. So that actually sustained us. And then we started doing consulting because I've done proposal writing and bid preparation, you know, the majority of my adult career. So I started outsourcing. You know, I would help people with proposals. And so that really is what carried us through the pandemic.
Thank you.
So our challenges in 2007 were the same during the pandemic, namely capital and capacity. As Melissa talked about, to get started, I had to empty out my retirement account. So from the very beginning, bookstores aren't seen as a profitable company, as a profitable business to banks. So for the longest time, getting access to capital, whether it's through the SBA, CDFIs I wasn't aware of as well, that was the hardest thing to do. So capital was challenged for the first 10 years. Capacity, because when we first started, I was working full-time and running the business supposedly part-time, but it was effectively full-time as well. Until the day that I actually left my job was when we were actually able to ramp up and actually take advantage of some of the opportunities that were there for us. Capacity still continues to be a challenge for us in finding the individuals with the expertise, right? Having the ability to pay for professionals with that experience that can provide us with the advice, the insight, the strategies to take us to the next level. So again, having the capital to be able to pay people what they deserve for their skill set, for their talents. The biggest challenge we had going into the pandemic and out of it was what really worked for us was that we were a physical bookstore. We're retail, we're B2C. So of course, DC shut down, and that eliminated our main source of income for us, which was events and selling books to our customers. However, we had always, as a strategy, as a principle, we've always tried to make sure we had multiple streams of income, that we had a variety of ways to get our products into customers' hands. So we had already built a website back when we first started in a way that small independent bookstores never had really looked at. So we were already trying to set the curve into how bookstores managed their website. So because we were able to easily flip the switch when our bookstore was shut down and really focus on online sales, virtual events, things like that, it became a lot easier for us to still maintain our customers, that connection, and actually grow the brand even more, because people got to, them being home, got to actually experience it a bit more of what we were offering in terms of an experience with literature.
Thank you. So seasoned entrepreneurs, veteran entrepreneurs, what advice would you have for your younger self as you were starting out buying a business, growing a business, but also for entrepreneurs who are in the room who are aspiring? We're all on different journeys. We all have different milestones in our entrepreneurial career. Even those who are tuned in live, talk to us a little about some of the insights that you've gleaned that you wish your younger self knew, but that you would also just pass on to people who are on the same journey as you. Lisa?
I don't think we have enough time for me to tell you everything. But one, like you talked about capital, really plan. When it comes to your personal credit, be very leery about using that to get started, if you can. So, you know, if there's any way to put a plan in place to get capital in advance, do that. Make sure you have that business plan and a strategic plan. The business plan is good for your day-to-day operations, but start thinking strategy. You know, yeah, here's where I am now, but where do you want to be in 5 years? Where do you want to be in 10 years? And don't wait until you're a year in to do that strategic plan. I think that's extremely key. And then start thinking about those incidences that may come up that you can control. A pandemic you can't control. And we all have an exit plan that if something were to happen to the owner, You have the key person insurance plans, you have those. But what if you become ill and you're the main person working? You know, how's your company going to keep going? Just try to put a little more planning in place. Marketing, like I said, you know, what agencies are you going to go after? Are you going private? Are you going straight to consumer? Are you going to just really think it out before you actually take over that business or start that business?
Thank you. Derek?
Yeah, I would say to my younger self, definitely plan that having a business plan is key. We had a business plan. However, I think what I would challenge myself and other entrepreneurs to think about is imagine yourself as your most successful iteration of what you want to do. And think about how do you duplicate yourself to be able to do that. If you are the key component in that, you're going to stagnate. If you have the type of growth that you want to have, you have to make sure that other people can step in and do those things that need to be done. You can't be the only one driving marketing strategy, branding strategy, operations, looking at the books. You have to create some type of system so that people can step in and make those things happen. Basically, I say to my team all the time, like, I can't be the only fire extinguisher. There's always going to be an issue. So I have to empower other people to be able to step in, be solution-oriented individuals, and grow the business as well. So creating simultaneously that type of plan, a system to allow yourself to be able to scale up when you actually have the kind of success you want to have.
Thank you. George, building off that question, first of all, please share a little bit about what you do with DC Public Library, but also talk about some of the resources that entrepreneurs should be taking advantage of in the library at all DC Public Libraries in DC.
I am the press secretary, which makes me sort of seem like a strange person to be here, as I am not an entrepreneur. But what the library tries to be really intentional about doing is thinking about how do we support people as they start and grow their businesses. So what we try to look at, not just probably in the DC Public Library, but probably in libraries across the country, particularly in urban areas, what we're seeing is us thinking about what are the needs, what are the problems, and how do we help people think about the library as a resource. In one sense, people sort of think of the library already because we are traditionally the place where I want to learn something new, I go to the library. But with Google and YouTube, often I didn't see it on Google or YouTube, let me come to the library. So how we sort of put everything is in three big buckets. We think about our collections, our connections, and potentially more so now, co-working. The way that we approach those three big buckets is we think about as entrepreneurs, I think you all speak to this more than I do, one of the things in order to be able to have profit is that you of course need to have income, but you need to mitigate as many expenses as you can. So we think about what do we offer at scale that makes sense for an entrepreneur. So let's start with the basic part, which is our collections. Libraries like the DC Public Library, in our buildings, we have wonderful people called librarians that if you come in and say, I'm looking to learn more about marketing, I'm trying to figure out how to systematize my building, they'll connect you with books, which everyone knows about. But what people don't think about is many of the things that we offer online and in a digital platform are things like access to business magazines. So with your library card, you can get access to Fast Company, Harvard Business Review, a ton of other business services and magazines to help you as an entrepreneur stay up to speed on whatever the new thing is. We also offer what we call databases. So think about as a marketer, I'm looking to see, hey, we're looking to go further into Prince George's County. How many bookstores catering to African American books are in the Clinton, Maryland area? Using library resources, for example, you can say, we're going to be right here, we're going to do a mile around it, and those databases can help you do that kind of market intelligence. We also have business plan builders, strategic plan builders, and other interactive things, so that it's not just the passive you have a book, but that they really help an entrepreneur go through those things. In the area of connections, one of the things that we really have been taking advantage of at the MLK Library, but also at neighborhood libraries, is partnerships. So we work with groups like the DC Department of Local Small Business Development. We have one-on-one technical assistance meetings in our meeting rooms on certain days during the week, where if you come in, you have one-on-one office time to sort of help you figure out whatever that business issue is. It could be I'm looking for more marketing resources, or I'm looking to navigate the government contracting services. Our colleagues from the Department of Local and Small Business Development are here to help you one-on-one. We also work with groups like Howard University Small Business Development Center. We work with Google in the digital inclusion program that they have through their coaches virtually, but going more and more into sort of hybrid online and in-person events. And then the last bigger bucket is sort of co-working. Libraries have meeting rooms, and as more and more people, since the pandemic in particular, are not necessarily working in an office, but they are working at home, and they need that sort of third place that's not easily interrupted, like maybe by a kid running in the background or something along those lines. We offer meeting rooms. So we have larger rooms for 50 to 100 people. We have smaller rooms for one-on-one. Most of those rooms now come with whiteboards or interactive monitors and free Wi-Fi. And for DC I can speak to, we basically offer free printing at a certain number. So that's sort of DC specific, but what we're finding is that libraries around the country offer that. So the best advice I could say is go to your library, talk to the staff there. The librarians who work there are more than happy to help you or connect you with the people that can help you.
Thank you, George. Librarians are your friends. I think that's how it goes.
Librarians are your friends.
But yeah, just to reiterate that, like you were saying, nationwide, I'm sure libraries are offering similar services as DC Public Library. So it's, as you know, as founders, as people who work, you know, the library is your friend as well, and it is a free resource to take advantage of. Thanks so much for that perspective. I'd like to turn it back to Derek, and I have a specific question for Lisa after that. But as you've been in business since 2005, that's a long time, and you have multiple establishments, physical establishments. Do you ever feel like, you know, you've made it? And at what point do you know, acknowledge that you are successful, because every day you wake up, you're turning on the lights of the bookstore, of the bookstores, plural. People are buying them, you know, but I asked that to also ask, you know, what's next? How do you keep growing when you're, you know, over a decade into what you're doing?
So you're getting into some of the growth stuff I'm dealing with here. By nature, I'm a grinder. So I look at what's right in front of me and I daily work at what I have to get accomplished to get to the next step. So there are times that my friends, my wife, who is my business partner, has to remind me, hey, you are accomplishing something. I feel successful in the fact that I'm doing what I'm passionate about. I feel successful in the fact that I'm serving my community. I feel successful in the fact that I can provide for my family. Those ways I feel like hugely successful. But I do have to, because of my personality, I have to take a step back and appreciate what we've been able to build. But the good part about that is it allows me to stay focused on how do I get to the next step, right? So right now, we do want to open up additional locations, but in order to do that in a safe, secure way that, you know, allows my team to not have to worry about anything, we have to have a system in place. You know, we have to be able to create, make things duplicatable so that when customers come into the store, they're getting the same experience no matter what. So those are things that we're focusing on now, just as we had the growth we've had over the last few years, to make sure that that is sustainable, so that when we take the next step, we do it in a way that is a lot easier for our team. They're not hectic running around, and our customers continue to see the same type of experience that is, you know, all about appreciating, you know, Black culture, Black literature, and allowing them to see themselves in a retail environment.
Thank you. And you were saying you have an online store, so people, Mahogany Books, online and in person in DC, please go visit. Lisa, you're sitting here and you are, it's great to talk to you because you are an example of the Inclusive Innovation Equity Impact Fund. And for those in the audience here and online who are not familiar with the Inclusive Equity Impact Fund, IIEIF, as we call it, because it's a mouthful. It is a venture capital fund that is strictly based in DC for DC businesses, enterprises. We have 1863 Ventures is the steward of this venture capital fund. Lisa is an investee of this fund. Currently, we have applications open until January 31st for the next round of investments into IIEIF. We have $2 million in which we're investing in DC-based businesses. We're calling these businesses equity impact enterprises because we do ask that you are at least 51% owned by a minority or a group of minorities. Lisa, Federal Contractors, as I was saying, is an investee in this portfolio. And Lisa, I'd like for you to share your perspective about IIEIF as a net benefit to your business in DC, and for people who are interested in applying, just what the process has been like for you being within this portfolio.
Okay. The fund had a huge impact on my business. It allowed me to hire a project manager this year, actually do my first office space, which isn't too far from Mahogany Books. We're right at MLK and Good Hope. So it definitely helped a lot as far as growing and actually still being here this year. The process itself was a very awakening process. It made you really think about your business even more than you do. We did a complete pitch deck that we presented, and it made me really, the strategic plan I was talking about, even though I had one, it really made me think about that and put into there everything about my business, from who I planned to work there, what agencies we were going to go after, when we would start to go with private. And it wasn't a time-consuming process because we had the financials, we had some of the things in place already. But it really makes you take all of those different components and put it in one place. So not only was it good for applying for the fund, but if something else comes up, you're not scrambling and trying to put all these different components together. They're all there. You tweak them, bring them current, and you have them. And the follow-up, it wasn't just, we're going to invest in you and then we're gone. It's the different seminars that, we get to take place in, the different events that happen, like the town hall. So it's, not only have you invested in me financially, I feel that I have almost like a separate entity that is working with me. If I have an idea, if I have a problem, I have someone that I can bounce that idea off. Because we don't always, as entrepreneurs, have the person to bounce everything off of. Your friends, you can bounce some ideas off of, fellow entrepreneurs, but no one has your unique situation. And I think 1863, after going through that process and talking, they know where I am, where I want to go, where I've been. So, it's easy to be able to bounce those ideas off of you.
Thank you. As we talk about this challenge of Beyond 5, the idea that Black businesses are surviving, but the access to capital is still a shortfall, is still something that we're still trying to hurdle over. Black founders are trying to hurdle over. The Inclusive Innovation Equity Impact Fund is a vehicle to access capital. So thank you, Lisa, for sharing that perspective. Again, I encourage everyone who's based in DC, who is an entrepreneur, who has an established business, to consider applying to IIEIF. The applications are still open until January 31st. Lisa, as she was just saying, is a shining example of what's possible within that portfolio, but just the resilience of businesses. So thank you, Derek, for being here. George, thank you for your perspective as well from DC Public Library. We're really grateful to be here. Are there any questions in the audience before we pass it over to the next panel? Yes.
Or maybe I can Well, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Dr. LaTanya White. Lisa and I were chatting earlier and just so excited to be connected with you. But I'm curious, Lisa, you said you acquired the business. What was your experience before
acquiring your construction business, and then how did you transfer that knowledge and that expertise into being in this space and even expanding from where you began?
So actually, I've been in construction. I worked for the company when it was established in 2003, but I'd also worked with the owner in her previous company. So I've done construction work probably for about 30-some years. So I've done administrative work. I've actually gone into the field a couple of times. I did purchasing. I've done project management. So they actually took me, and we just built my experience all the way up. So once I took it over, like I said, I knew how to run the company, but the internal part of the company, managing the company was a little different. So that's where I had to rely on accelerators and different programs to give me that management component of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for the panel. Appreciate it. Can you hear me clear now? My name is Jamal Robinson. Appreciate everyone's time. Lisa, you mentioned have a business plan for, and I didn't capture it, and then you mentioned have a strategic plan for your day-to-day activities. Could you articulate that point again for me?
So I said have a business plan
Thank
that
you.
kind of takes care of your day activities of how you want the business to run, but make sure you have a strategic plan in place that tells you where you want to take the business, not just day to day, but plan for the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, where you want to go and figure out how you're going to get there and start putting that in place. So as you're going on day to day, you can build in some of those duties and some of those things that you need to do along the way. So especially when you're working, if you're a solopreneur, even though we are companies, a lot of times it's just us working. So you have to, you may be working in the business during the day, but in the evening, who do I need to reach out to? Who do I need to email? What mailing list do I need to get in? What organizations do I need to look into so I can network? So it's, everyone says a business plan, and that you definitely have to have that, but I think the strategic part is just as important.
We're actually going to wrap up. We'll have a question and answer at the end of our sessions at 4:45. Thank you. We're going to move on to the next panel featuring Chris Wheat, Joe Scantlebury, and Melissa Bradley. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. While they come down and get mic'd up and swap out, I want to just do a couple of acknowledgments. I sat down and I told you it's well enough, so I want to acknowledge all the people who are watching at home. If you live in D.C., y'all go to it. I feel like when it rains in D.C., y'all act like it's snow. So kudos to the folks who have made it. I also want to acknowledge one of our board members, Cindy, who is here from Keynote. I want to acknowledge one of our advisors, Ken, who is here. We are grateful to have him. I want to shout out, how many people from, I guess, are y'all, like, how long y'all been in D.C.? Like, how many people like D.C., One is the entrepreneurs, because we think it's important that fellow entrepreneurs hear from their peers, because they actually understand the journey. One of the things that we are crystal clear about at 1863 is that everybody may want to be a coach, but everybody's qualified to be a coach. I am an entrepreneur snob. If you have never run a business, you cannot tell me how to run one. If you have never had to take out a part of your insurance policy to make payroll, you do not understand my risk tolerance. And while I could have been mad at the woman at the SBA, I wasn't, because I realized as a corporate executive, she didn't have the same risk tolerance that I had. She didn't know that I had already saved my rent for months and I was willing to take that risk. So I think that that's really important. But we also know there are people like these two gentlemen who are consistently on a day-to-day basis fighting for what it means to be able to support Black entrepreneurs. So I'm going to ask Chris and then Joe, just introduce yourself first, and then we're going to have a conversation.
Thank you. I am very glad to be here on this. It's Thursday, I think. Yes. It's been a long week. So my name is Chris Wheat. I am the president of the JP Morgan Chase Institute. We have, among other things, looked into small business finances and really just trying to understand the ecosystem as a whole. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation.
I'm Joe Scantlebury. Good to be here. I'm the CEO of Living Cities. We are a nonprofit, but we're really a collaboration of philanthropy and financial institutions, all of whom committed themselves to expanding economic opportunity and addressing racial equity and closing the racial income and wealth gap. Good to be here.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with a very benign question. And so what were your thoughts on what we've shared so far from the research and the entrepreneurs? What were your initial reactions? Because I said my phone is blowing up for everybody who decided to be on video, and they're sharing their reactions. One people like, nailed it, oh my God, who else is paying attention? Is somebody gonna do something? Is there more money coming my way? What were your initial reactions, since you see some of this stuff every single day?
Yeah, so I had said before, we do a fair amount of research on small businesses, and you really seem to sort of nail a bunch of the things that are consistent with at least what we've seen. We don't have the same approach, right? So we use de-identified administrative data at scale to try to look at some of these things, and sometimes we can see things similar and sometimes we can't. But you sort of had the fun fact about the age of the entrepreneur. I think it's a common misconception, sort of both within our community, but sort of more broadly as well, that having the experience, and even heard that on the panel a little bit, really makes a big difference in being able to succeed as an entrepreneur. Having access to the same kind of resources has a lot to do with you framed it as the survivability. We looked at it from the other way, like the exit rate, but many of the findings that I saw on the screen, and from what I heard on the panel, were quite similar to things we had seen in our research as well.
Great. Joe?
So first, I think the work is brilliant. I just have to say it was plain, clear, revealing, and spoke to what we know to be true, but we never really quite put it together in ways that we can speak to powerfully. And I'll just go anecdotal. My mother never got a driver's license, ever. Though she thinks she could drive, but she never drove.
Sounds like our teenager.
New Yorker. But she ended up being the president of a trucking business. And when she was the president of that business, it thrived, because she knew how to talk to people, how to work things out, how to delay payments, because, you know, we ain't gonna pay the light bill, but we're gonna get the diesel. These trucks need the diesel. No, you ain't getting no special anything for the holidays, because we gotta pay the diesel. We need tires, and all of that happened. But what they could never do was get extra capital from anybody legit to help them run this business, even though it was thriving, successful, they were getting new contracts, and all it took was an accident or two before it was all over. Okay? And what I saw in the data is just that stark fact that by the time we're all in, I think Derek Young, when he spoke about it, he was all in. Credit cards, everything, all in. That ability and that willingness to do that is not valued as a metric for success. And that's what spoke to me.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Chris, you do this all the time, so what are some other trends that you're seeing around small businesses that those of us who say we're here to help them should be thinking about, and where possible, the positive stuff too?
So one thing we have relatively recently seen in the research that I think is a through line, and it almost, you know, is, like you said, a validation of the kind of story you were just telling, is that close connection between the financial life of the entrepreneur and the financial life of the business. I think sometimes people who aren't in the space but are trying to help don't see that overlap and kind of think of it as a separate thing. We look at your business and what's your business plan, and that's important. But really seeing that kind of through line between the financial health of the family that owns the business, or the person and their family, and sort of the success of the business. I mean, we look at that in a kind of narrow way. We had a particular study where we were trying to understand how liquidity, the amount of cash a person had available to them before they started a business, was playing into the success of the business. And in particular, is that combined amount of capital growing a lot? And for many, many businesses, it isn't. It's not the only places that we see that sort of that tie through, but if you had a little before, you don't have a whole lot after. If you have more, you might be the kind of business that can make that investment that you can kind of like grow and stuff like that. But it wasn't enough to just understand what was happening in the business. You really need to see outside of that. So that's one of the things that I think, again, sort of borrowing your framing, for the people who have done the work before and have lived it, maybe it's not as much of an aha, but a lot of people come into the ecosystem from different places, and sort of helping them understand that feature, I think, is really important.
Yeah. At Living Cities, you all do a lot of things, and we're grateful to you and Santiago for the work you did in cities. Talk a little bit about the CTG initiative and what were you hoping to discover?
Sure. I know I was a board member when CTG was launched, and it was launched at a time when Living Cities made a very intentional, we're a 31-year collaborative, but there was a very intentional decision to think about racial equity specifically, because so many things have been tried, so many efforts have been made, and foundations and philanthropies across the country are always trying to address poverty, address need, address charitable needs. And some are systematic, some are charitable, but the members of Living Cities agreed, and I was there when it happened, that by ignoring race, we were ignoring one of the real drivers for the inequity in the country. So this is pre-George Floyd. That commitment was made. And the Closing the Gaps effort was really a thought that, what can we do in cities? First, let's level set. Let's engage in one of our partners, the PSAB, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and let's begin to have a similar conversation of what we're talking about. Let's talk about racism clearly and specifically. Now you can imagine, so there are some financial institutions that were like, we're gonna talk about racism explicitly? And they were a little uncomfortable. And we made it safe to have the conversation. We made it safe to think about it and understand that what we were all looking at is a system that perpetuated the inequities that we actually are dealing with. Okay, so that's one. Then the question was, how do you engage with communities, both city leaders and community leaders, in ways that really spoke to the economic realities in cities? Unfortunately, the pandemic hobbled us from being on the ground in the ways that we would have liked to have been, and we're just getting back to that. And what we're seeing is that home ownership, enterprise ownership, that those are critical wealth building pathways that cities want to double down on, think about, and try to really navigate the changing shifts in political leadership, because at the end of the day, the community is still the community, no matter who's in that city leadership. Sure. How do we navigate that? So our hope is to do this deeply in a number of places, share it across a broad network, make sure that local philanthropy, national philanthropy can leverage and lift up what we're learning, and frankly, where there are systemic gaps and barriers, how do we remove them? How do we remove them? You show up at your brown face, that should not be risk automatically, right? For either a home ownership or for your ability to use resources. There's all this public money coming to cities. And we already know that the piping is already set. So how do you actually diversify the piping so that all the commitments that the administration, federal administration has declared, how do you ensure that that money actually shows up in the hand of black and brown geniuses, right? Or the folks that the data have laid out are able, capable out here, but frankly are never included. Yep. That's part of the flow of capital that we intend to lean into. So I'll stop there, because I could go on and on and on and on. Sorry.
We got more questions, and just to tee up, we didn't plan this in advance, because I trust y'all, and I think you trust me. But the last conversation we're having is actually with Assistant Secretary Alejandra Castillo from the Department of Commerce. So we will talk about what the Fed is doing with that money and how do we get it.
That's right.
Your role at JP Morgan Chase Institute is to look at this data. You look at this all the time. What are, post-COVID and post-George Floyd, what are 2 or 3 of the statistics that were shocking in terms of the amplification of that devastation to Black and brown entrepreneurs pre and post these major shifts?
That is both a great question and a great framing. I'm going to try to not go on and on as you were just sort of like.
No, it's all good.
No, because there's a lot to say with this. The pre and post-George frame. So we had been looking at differences by race, and not just some small business outcomes. I mean, that was sort of what my team had been doing at the time, but sort of across the board, sort of household finance as well. And some of these patterns will be similar. I will focus on entrepreneurship because that's what we're talking about today. I mean, shocking probably isn't the right word because I mean, day to day, right? But documenting and making it concrete, especially for people who don't live, is really important. But to see the differences in the resources available to Black-owned businesses as compared to white, I'm going to get her and try to say a number live without looking at the chart, but order of magnitude 40 cents on the dollar.
Wow.
In terms of revenue, right? So for same kind of business, started with the same sort of all around, same industry, blah, 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 all those things. Black-owned businesses are operating typically around $40,000 a year in revenue for the whole universe of Black-owned businesses as compared to more like $100,000 a year. Like a much, much bigger gap than you even see for like income. Like it's really, really big. Liquidity, that amount of cash that they're going to operate on at a couple of weeks of operation, so like quite a lot. And that's all before COVID and George Floyd happened to happen at the same time, and maybe it happened to happen exactly, right? There's some interplay there in terms of how our co-citizens reacted to George Floyd. It may have something to do with that. The policy response, in terms of both COVID policy and then some things that followed on after that, was lowercase p progressive in the sense that a lot of the policies were structured in a way that happened to proportionally land more on lower income families. So this was surprising and unusual, and let's call it incidental, right? It wasn't clear that the policy was designed to be so progressive, but if you give kind of the same amount of money to people and it's not sensitive to their income, like it's going to be like a relatively bigger chunk. And so we saw this unexpected sort of spike for low-income families, for smaller businesses, and all those things. And then the persistence of that, and the sort of you'd have to believe that there was going to be that same kind of intentionality and focus in a non-incidental way. And I don't know that there will, right? It's a little bit the long story short. But it was kind of surprising in all those directions. One, how big is the gap? 2, what happens when you have a policy that happens to be progressive in terms of the way it can not entirely close the gap, but at least, sort of make it slow down or sort of shrink a little bit. And then what it kind of suggests about how hard it would be to continue to close those gaps and to continue to get the pipes redirected. Right. It takes a lot of bending, to undo hundreds of years of bending in another direction. So those were the most kind of surprising things to me.
Gotcha. And I think it's interesting because I'm so glad you said that, because I think people say, well, I wonder why all these Black people started businesses post the pandemic. Yeah. And I was like, well, one, they finally had the resources to do so, right? Yeah. Because Uncle Sam kind of became our friends and family. But also, it was a moment around racial reckoning of like, I'm tired of sitting here in a very big corporate plantation-like style. I think I can do better by my damn self. And so I think you're right. It was a confluence of unexpected actions. When you think about your leadership at Living Cities, and congratulations on your new role from board to CEO, what are you most excited about, and where does Living Cities stake its next 5 to 10 year investment?
Wow. So we just had a retreat. I just jumped on a train to get down here.
We appreciate that.
Brilliant, energetic staff who are really thinking through how we lean into wealth building. And wealth building, frankly, is one of those things, and we're in a library, so I'm going to talk about Hannah Nicole's book, 1619, the revised version. What was beautiful about that for me when she took all the feedback, and then she said, I'm gonna take all the feedback and I'm gonna revise this thing. When she did it, what was clear is that the violence, both policy violence, the individual violence, the lynchings, and we all now have witnessed a public lynching, right, in George Floyd. And but for the pandemic, all of us being home, we probably would not have watched that. But we all saw it together. And what we saw in America was that people said, we don't want that. Black, white people, we don't want that. We don't want that to be us. So it highlighted that there's this body of folks, even those who didn't take the streets, who want change. The only way we get to change, particularly as it relates to wealth, is if you're either an owner or you're able to secure the capital to invest in the dreams and ideas that of all those people the report highlighted, all those people who are hidden from capital. And hidden because either the people who are directing capital don't want to see them, aren't willing to see them, or frankly aren't willing to see the evidence of all the fund managers of color that my colleagues who lead our Capital for the New Majority work have uncovered for many years. We even formed a cohort of fund managers of color called Builders and Benefactors who are informing our next venture, which is a fund to funds. We're calling it Catalyst Fund 3. But the idea here is how do we support all these fund managers of color who frankly are trying to close this wealth gap? Yep. So, and what can we learn from using capital investment and investment in founders and creators of color like the last panel we just heard from? That's one. Two, I think we're going to be partnering very deeply to figure out city by city who wants to have a sustained effort in closing these gaps. And I know that there's a lot of energy. We have people in the room right now who've been doing a lot of great work for many years. We want to lift up that work. We want to lift up the investments that philanthropy has been putting forward and share that knowledge. Because the knowledge, knowing that it's possible, and knowing that you're not the odd man or woman out trying to do something. No, you're just not connected. And frankly, at Living Cities, we believe that everybody can live an economically sustainable life. You know, Chris, one can thrive, should be able to live abundantly, but more importantly, can be connected. And those connections may not always look like you, but those connections matter in being able to continue to move forward.
Yeah. I'm going to give you a moment. I'll give you a wait. But I want to acknowledge, since you called out the Capital for the New Majority, that Dimitri Duckett, everybody can't see him, but he's here rocking his fur. He is leading that amazing work and has been in this field for a long time. And I want to acknowledge his co-conspirator, Janae, who also was part of the Builders and Benefactors. And I would say that I think what's interesting is that we've spent, just to flip it for a second, talking about entrepreneurs, but post-George Floyd, we also saw over $500 billion go to capital providers. That's right. And that was the first time that people like myself, right, and many others who manage assets were like, whoa, people are actually looking for us. And what's, I think, significant about the work that JP Morgan is doing, the Institute is doing, what we're doing, and others in Living Cities, is that when that money came, we had to have the evidence of why we deserved it. And beyond $1 million here or there, right? And so we now have funds that are run by Black and brown fund managers that are not just micro funds of $20 million and below, but they're 50, they're 70, they're 100, they're $250 million funds, which is significant because the reality is now that I believe, but we'll hear from the Assistant Secretary, that the subsidies are beginning to go away on the government side from a PPP perspective, who's gonna pick that up? And so I think it's significant that you're both on the supply side and the demand side of capital. Right. You good? Yeah. Okay, it's all good. So as we think about what do we say to ecosystem builders? What are the recommendations you would have to folks? I mean, obviously, there's a little bit of a gap between you and the bank, but we know JP Morgan Chase has a huge Advancing Black Pathways. It's run by Bonnie Elliott, who comes out of the banking field. What are some recommendations you would have to people here or who are watching to say, like, what are those of us who say every day we're here to help Black and brown folks, what should we be doing?
That's a good question. I think the concentration of interest over the last couple of years has given people opportunities to try a lot of things. Mm-hmm. Excuse me, man. I think the effort that's going to be helpful for those who are going to stay in the game for a long time is to try really hard to learn what has and what hasn't worked. I think the studies, we have an opportunity to look now to see what wasn't working when there was enough resources in the environment to do some of these things. I don't know that there's going to be as many opportunities to do that experimentation and have the opportunity for some of them to fail so that we can learn. For people to really focus on understanding what worked over the last couple of years. So, I mean, that would be my probably first, second, and third push, is really take the time to appreciate the uniqueness of the last couple of years as an experimental opportunity to learn things. So that's probably what I focus on.
Thank you. Joe, what would be your recommendation?
I think we have to connect the dots. I think we have to connect the dots in the experiments that have existed, those that have failed, those that have succeeded. I think there's lots of different ventures that have to be lifted up. I think we have to figure out how to connect the technical assistants, the people who know and who understand how, so that you don't just have 5,000 emails saying, Melissa, I just saw you online, help me out. Because, you know, we love you, and I know you're generous, but 5,000 every week, unsustainable. So how do we spread that wealth, spread that knowledge, and how do we be intentional about that? I think we also have to be very insistent that the policy conversation is one around growth and opportunity. Many of the entrenched interests and folks who have said, hey, we're doing fine, we don't need to go any further, we don't need to discover anybody new. That is just bad economics in every kind of way. There are people that you invest in and you grow. We do not get to growth as a nation without including everybody.
That's right.
Period. And I find it anti-democratic, I find it anti-American that we don't see Latinos and say, hey, how do we pull these folks into this opportunity? I know that Unidos is really campaigning an effort to make sure that more Latinos own homes. Same barriers, same barriers. How do we unite on that and say to the industry, hey, mortgage, maybe there's a different way to think about mortgage. Maybe there's a different way to think about how we use PMI. Maybe there's a different way to ensure that when folks are going through hardship, they don't automatically lose their homes. What a concept. What about if you own your home and you've owned it forever and you've never missed a payment, but you can't get any money to actually redo it, refresh it until the neighborhood gentrifies, right? Hey, what's that about? You see the neighborhood changing, why can't I get a nickel to improve my home? All of these things can be done because all of the inequities that were created to privilege white economic opportunity. We are now in a place where we can undo those policies without taking any bread off anybody else's plate. Let's just make sure we're intentional about making sure everybody can eat.
Yeah, I think that the point is a really important one. Manny, who works with us, who does all the design work, he texted me and he's like, what does this mean? And he sent me the page and it says, use asset framework to think about. And he was like, what does that mean? And I think you nailed that, right? I think that too often when you see the reports from Citi that talks about the opportunity cost of not investing in Black and brown folks, that's when people get motivated. But instead of it always being from a deficit, how do we really approach our community and say, look, there is a lot of time, there's a lot of talent, there's a lot of wealth that has been pent up, right, or stolen. How do we think about using and leveraging the resources that have been here for years to actually advance the larger American dream, right? Because the lack of investing in us is actually a disadvantage in terms of us being competitive in the larger world, you know, the world structure. So I think that that's really an important point. Last question for each of you before we go to Assistant Secretary. If you were to think about, this was looking beyond 5 years, if each of you had the opportunity to say what was going to happen in 5 years in this space, or what do you want to have happen, what would you say? And I asked that question specifically because I spent a lot of time with other accelerators and incubators, and much like any other nonprofit or social impact organization, we're oftentimes on fiscal cycles and not on aspirational strategic plan dream cycles. And so I'm curious, where do you see and what do you think the opportunity is 5 years from now?
Okay. You want to start?
5 years from now. I think there's going to be, man, I'm going to predict something on the record. Huh?
We'll say you're answering in your unofficial capacity.
In an unofficial capacity. No, I mean, I think there's a lot of innovation and creative thinking about different ways to finance small businesses across the board. And like I said, there's still like a bunch of people who hadn't have their attention focused on thinking about Black-owned businesses, businesses owned by people of color, people, LGBT community. And so I don't want to give like too much precision because I really don't know, but like just like seeing all of those people start to think about these problems, acceleration in the fintech space, some of those things aren't going to work well, right? But I think that the financing ecosystem might look appreciably different in 5 years out from now in a way that I couldn't know what it's going to be, but it's going to come from something that somebody has, like they're working on right now, they're trying it out, they're still sort of cycling around, and so that's probably what I would like.
I like the optimism.
Yeah.
I'd say 3 things. First, I think the members and those who join our table will use their collective voice and their collective opportunity to do a couple of things really powerfully. One, certainly make sure that our fund gets off the ground, because I think it'll be a great exemplar of what's possible, and I think it'll continue to grow exponentially beyond our nonprofit structure and beyond. That's one. 2, CDFIs need to be supercharged. Supercharged, and that pathway needs to be made plain and obvious, and we need to make the cost, the transactional cost of being reviewed and engaging and finding capital much lower. And I think there's a way to do that, but it's going to have to be a massive effort that frankly says, we want new ideas, we want new energy, and America's open for business, and you are part of that vision. And then lastly, and this is going to sound a little odd, but your data really speaks to this, so I'm going to use your data. Women of color across this country who have been supporting families, taking a nickel and finding how to turn it into a quarter, right? Which my mother did for like forever, okay? Should walk into this space feeling like this is our space. So in 5 years, what I'd like to see is a national campaign where women of color in particular feel empowered to step into this space, knowing that it was built for you, and there's no rule in it that you can't figure out. There's no part of the game that you can't master. So let's go get it.
I'm there.
Let's
I'm
go
there.
get it.
We're ready. We ready? We're ready. All right. This sister asked a question. She had her hand up for a question. Yes, or you were just raising your hand saying amen? Okay, that was the amen corner. Okay, I'm just checking. Well, then please let us thank Joe and Chris for joining us. Thank you. Thank you, brother. Appreciate you. Thank you. Appreciate you. Thank you. Oh, sorry. It's always good when you have friends who do good work. And on that note, I might get it wrong, but I'm just going to let her introduce herself. So I am thrilled to now move what Joe teed up so well, which is a policy conversation, and to figure out where all that money is my friend. I'm going to start with that, Alejandra Castillo. Thank you. What she got? So her official title is U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development. I won't say how I know her, but we just call her Allie. So I really appreciate you being here. Before we start in the official capacity, and I have questions that I know your team are good with, tell us about yourself, because I think that people, I say that because I think people, like when I worked in the ministry, like, you government people, I'm like, but the government is comprised of people who actually really do care. It's certain parts of the government that don't allow that empathy and skill set to come through. So I would love for people just to know, like, who are you? Because that's a hell of a title.
Well, thank you, Melissa. It's great to see you. Melissa keeps me real, and I'm sure she keeps you all real, because I have a great admiration not only for her intellect, but for her big heart. You ask a question that I'm always, I never like to talk about, but I am the daughter of immigrants from the Dominican Republic who came to New York City in the 70s. The city was facing its worst moment. It was in receivership. My father started a grocery store business in the Bronx. It was tough. But I learned early on about a couple of things. One is how entrepreneurs are the lifeblood of our economy, small businesses in particular. They are the bravest people. They open businesses when there is no friends and family circle, when situations and conditions are really tough, but they have that dream. I believe that for entrepreneurs of color, it's not to have that big house, it's to create jobs for our families. I mean, we hire our cousins and our uncles and our aunts and uncles and everything like that. The other thing that I learned at that moment in time as a young person was the duality of New York City, the formal and the informal economy. And I think we can attest to that. But the duality as well of the haves and have-not. The duality of the shadows that really make the city tick. And I was puzzled and curious and didn't understand that. And then I came to DC and I've been here for 30 years. I love government. I believe in government, but I also recognize it is not the solution to everything. However, to Joe's point, we have to make sure that we're connecting those dots. We have to make sure that we are involved, engaged, and asking the tough questions. And you and I are cut from the same cloth in many ways because we like to rock the boat. It shouldn't be easy. If government says, oh, we've taken care of that, something's amiss because these are tough conversations. We're at a moment in time when what keeps me up at night is to see the amount of dollars that are coming down the pike, and then to look around the table and say, where are our communities of color? And then they said, well, we didn't know about it. It's like, how do we make sure that we get the timing right, that we are in these applications, that we can have advocates? Long-winded answer.
No, it's all good. So do people even know what the Economic Development Administration is? Okay, not enough people. Not enough people. So we know the lovely building, Department of Commerce, that you can never park to. It's hard to get to. It's not meant to be entered. It's scary. And then there's this. It's massive. And then there's this place called EDA. What is EDA?
So let me start with that massive Department of Commerce. There are 13 different agencies, and each agency, whether you understand it or not, or you felt it or not, touches your life. The Census Bureau. The census is a key instrument for business owners. It tells you who lives where, what's the demographic, what's the profile, and also predicts who's going to be living in certain parts of the country. So sometimes you may drive around and all of a sudden you see a McDonald's or a hotel in the middle of nowhere. It's because that company has looked at the census and said, in 15 years, there will be a population there. So let me buy that land at a lower price before all of it gets populated.
I kind of double click on that because I hate filling it out. Lord knows I never read the data. Now I know I'm going to read it with a different lens. Okay, I got you. All right, I'm all in.
And you have to read it with a different lens because it tells you where your customers are and who are your future customers. Then you have NTIA, National Telecommunication and Information Agency, broadband. $48 billion is going out the door for broadband. If the pandemic taught us anything was that broadband is essential. Communities of color didn't have access to broadband. Our kids didn't have access to broadband. Our elderly didn't have access to telemedicine. Our entrepreneurs didn't have e-commerce. They couldn't survive the pandemic because there was no e-commerce for them too. Then you have, NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. How many of you have heard about the CHIPS Act? Semiconductors, $52 billion going into that space. And then you have, you can go on, you have USPTO, U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. One thing that I am very adamant about, and I know you are too, is our entrepreneurs, you are inventors in your own way. How are you protecting your intellectual property? That is USPTO. And oh, by the way, we have a lot of inventors of color, but it's hard to get a patent, it's hard to trademark. So how do we make that easier? I'm not going to go through all the 13, but EDA is one of those 12. So is MBDA, the Minority Business Development Agency.
Which you used to run.
Which I used to run under the Obama administration. But EDA, it's the ecosystem. And I know that the panel before was called ecosystem, but we build the ecosystem for businesses and communities to thrive. And what does that mean? That means a lot of things. That means, for example, a downtown that has been forgotten, there's no pipelines or sewage or just the structure. We can build that. We do a lot of construction. We are your classic public works, but we also do tech and innovation. And Melissa, you are a member of our National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. We are bringing folks to the table to think about what is the next arc of the economic landscape. What does that look like? And I will tell you, I know that you asked a question about 5 years. I don't have a crystal ball, nor do I pretend to have one. But I do like to engage in the exercise of what if. And right now, you're looking at 4 major pieces of legislation, going back to the policy that President Biden has signed into law: the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. You probably say, well, what does that all mean? That means $2.4 trillion that is going out the door. And we'll talk about how that's going out the door, which is going into communities and into new industries. Mm-hmm. You know, right now there's Shelby Sales over at Department of Transportation, $5 billion for minority-owned companies to get into the electric vehicle charging station. Let's pause for a second. You know, if somebody would have said 100 years ago there will be a gas station in every other corner, people would have said, oh, you're crazy, you're crazy. I will tell you that 5 years from now, you'll have an electric vehicle charging station pretty much in every structure. Who's going to build that? Who's going to maintain that? Who's in that space? The government is saying, $5 billion, let's get this engine revving up, and let's build the next generation of entrepreneurs. Look, you and I can talk forever about these areas, but here's what I will say. This money in many ways is going from the federal government to the states. And for many years, we've had a federal approach to all this work. I would submit to you, we need to have a state approach. And I know we're in the District of Columbia. I've been a resident of the District of Columbia, so that conversation about a state.
Yes.
But for those of you who are listening, who are joining us virtually, there has to be a strategy, whether you're in the DMV area, how is this money going to flow? Because now we have put the state in the middle of it to really talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in all spectrums. So I hope I didn't confuse you too much, but I hope you are also picking up the excitement and the passion. And it's this collaboration, because Melissa's on the outside, I'm on the inside. We talk and we say, you know, how do we get our folks savvy and really put these dollars into good use?
Yeah. And let me just say, because I think people be like, oh, you know, here's yet another political bureaucrat. But you had myself and Nathan, I know you've been doing that, of bringing outsiders in to share this data and to represent like who is really on the ground that can do this work. Government is supposed to be unbiased, so let's just cut to the chase. How do businesses access this money? Because we saw with PPP, it kind of went to the normal channels. How do we make sure it doesn't go to the normal channels when for the first time it's actually earmarked for new communities?
Correct. So the PPP was very designed to go specifically to businesses. Much of these dollars do not necessarily go to businesses. They go to entities and ecosystems. So you should be working with your state legislator, you should be working with your mayors, you should be part of what's called comprehensive economic development strategies. 390 economic development districts in the country. Look it up, look up who's involved in developing your community's economic development strategy, okay? If you should be either speaking to them or getting yourself involved in that, because these are the individuals who are setting up the landscape for the future. Those entities can apply for much of these dollars. And when they apply for these dollars, they're helping your ecosystem to be much more robust. There are other grants, for example, the Build to Scale, you and I talked the other day, has 2 pieces to it, the capital challenge and then the venture challenge. We need more nonprofit organizations involved in the economic development space. Because you can't talk about entrepreneurship unless you're talking about economic development. It goes hand in hand. You can't talk about entrepreneurship, economic development, unless you're talking about workforce development. It's all interconnected. I usually say economic development is not linear. It's not a one straight shot. It has so many different facets. So again, go to our website. We have annual appropriations. We have 6 different offices across the country. You can always reach me. My email is simple, acastillo@eda.gov. And, you know.
Your staff is like,
I know, he's like, oh no.
God.
But, you know, but we work, but I know, because it's a lot. It's a lot. And I know that, you know, you mentioned that you get so many emails. But I know the reality. I'm not going to be there for a long time, right? These jobs are finite. And what I hope you're picking up is urgency. We don't have any moments to wait in terms of what can we do or how can we do it. This collaboration, this coalition is what needs to happen, and it needs to happen pretty quickly.
And I think what's interesting is I didn't realize until I joined the advisory council that Commerce has most money for small businesses. I think people automatically think SBA, but people really need to understand. But in case they don't, and this is the first time I'm hearing about it, can you talk about how they all work together?
Sure. So a couple of things, you know, and forgive me because you're going to hear this word over and over again, ecosystem, right? So we know that a community that doesn't have good broadband cannot really, in the 21st century, cannot develop as quickly as it can be. So working again with NTIA, bringing those dollars into the communities. That's why I work a lot with mayors and state legislators and governors and members of Congress, obviously. But NTIA is playing a huge role. Before NTIA got its money, we would do a lot of broadband, helping create that. As again, we do a lot of construction. So business hub, entrepreneurship hubs, innovation hubs. We have funded commercial kitchens. We have funded, we not only build the building, but we also provide dollars for the equipment. So that can help too. International trade, I didn't speak about the International Trade Administration. For businesses, we should not only be thinking about customers domestically, but customers abroad. We know that minority-owned businesses are twice as likely to export because of linguistic and cultural ties. We just had the Africa Summit. This whole town was like on lockdown because of traffic, because we had the Africa Summit. The African continent provides us with great opportunities for small businesses as well. So ITA works very closely with small businesses to do that. MBDA works directly with small businesses. As a matter of fact, they just received $100 million for the state small business credit initiative, SSBCI, which we didn't even talk about Treasury, but the SSBCI program should be something that we should translate more.
So can you share, because that is a program that DC, although it's not a state, is participating in.
It's participating, and that's opportunities for capital, for credit. Again, these are programs that they're very massive, yes indeed, but when you start to tear them apart, it's not enough. It's not enough. So what we need to make sure is, and this is where the collaboration with 1863 is leverage. And that's a word that we need to make sure that have it in our vocabulary. How do we leverage SSBCI to get other types of capital? How do we leverage the monies that are coming in for infrastructure to then leverage dollars to build on the non-infrastructure work? So again, I'm happy to share with you websites and others, but if we have a time to do a webinar, maybe we invite our friends over at Treasury, because we definitely need to start teasing out what does this all mean. But what I'll tell you what this means is the economy is changing. And if we're not driving that change, we are going to be playing catch up, trying to do contortionism to even be part of it. So I'm just trying to sound the alarm, let's get involved. Let's figure out where you think you can play best. But it's exciting. It's really a moment in time that I think we need to make sure that we're part of.
I'm going to ask one more question, and make any questions from the audience. I believe that you're allowed to ask questions, I'm not sure. The last question I have for you is, I think people understand this world of, political appointees, And so what is it that any of us can be doing so that when it is your time to leave, the work and focus on the communities that are represented in this room stay firm? Because I will say, having been on what you call the FACA before and being on it now, it's a very different conversation. And I want to make sure that you, as Joseph, get your flowers, because when I walked into the FACA this time versus last time, there was explicit conversation around Black and brown businesses. There was explicit conversation around urban communities. It was explicit around understanding the nuances. How can we support that and continue to be a core part of the conversation?
So I'm going to talk about the bureaucratic way to support that, and then the non-bureaucratic way to support that. You know, there's a lot of calls for opinions and for the public to chime in different policy-making roles. I know that people are skeptical. Do they really read them? Yes, we do read them. And that's a bureaucratic way of being part of the conversation. I do also have to recognize that, again, Melissa and I have worked in previous administrations, the Obama, the Clinton administration, but the Biden administration did something very powerful, and that was the first executive order was on equity. And why was that important? That was important because every grant, at least the ones that came out of EDA, had an equity piece in it. We changed our investment policy priorities, and equity was at the forefront. That makes a difference because when you bake it into the grants, you can't avoid it.
That's right.
Now, we do have a challenge, which is, okay, we got equity in the grant. How do we keep it throughout the life cycle of the grant itself? And that's where we have to make sure that we put the fire under people's feet. I just think that what I'm trying to do at EDA is to make sure that we are bringing in the talent that are going to be part of the future, that we are structurally changing how things are done. You gave us you gave us a lot of food for thought when you came in on Monday about not just inputs and outcomes, but impact. To make sure that when we're talking to looking at proposals, that we're not just looking at what people are going to do, but do they have the past performance to actually do the equity work that needs to get done? That really resonated, and people were very thankful for that. But again, we have to be, as both Chris and Joe mentioned in the previous panel, very diligent, keeping this sustainable, keeping this alive. I too feel it's very different. In previous administration, we could barely even talk about Black and brown.
That's right. Even in the Black administration.
Correct. Correct.
You couldn't say that, I can.
But it's a different moment in time.
Yes, it is.
The country has gone through really painful moments, not just with the murder of George Floyd, the pandemic, the spotlight of the gaps, and that has hit a core. And I think, Joe, you mentioned how it's, in order for it to be true democracy, we must make sure that everybody comes along. And one of the things that in my travels that I hear all the time are people saying, I feel invisible, I feel left behind. Nobody has come to my community. Nobody has seen the challenges that we have to face. So this is a moment of important reckoning, and we need to leverage all of these dollars to make sure that communities are not only seen, but that they move the needle. And that's satisfying.
Well, I want to thank you. I know it's the end of the day for you and your team. I am privileged to call you a friend. I was skeptical when you went back in the administration. I was like, whoa, you're going in for another term. But I'm deeply grateful that you're there, because I think that you touched upon the fact that no matter who's been president, this is the most money that we have ever had as a country. I mean, the allocation that EDA has gotten is the biggest ever. And I could see in the best way possible, your team was overwhelmed by that. And so to the extent that we have ecosystem builders here or watching, they can get engaged. I do not want to have entrepreneurs wasting time necessarily in policy, but thinking about how can they strategically engage and give feedback. Because I will say, having served, we are required to read those things. So we do read what you have to say, good, bad, or indifferent. And then I just want to say thank you to you. I think the last note that I want to end on is that while we focus a lot of this research, the respondents were Black women. We are very clear at 863 to say the new majority, because the reality is that part of the success that other communities have had is through our division. And so I'm grateful to you for continuing to uphold the Black-Brown collaboration, for holding us in your journeys, and hopefully we do well by you, vice versa. And personally, I can't wait for you to get on the outside so we can make some good trouble together. So thank you to Assistant Secretary.
Thank you. Thank you. Looking for what you got there.
I want to thank all of you who are here for coming out and for, there we go, braving the rain. Thank you. This is real DC people right here. For those of us who joined us via live stream, thank you for doing that. This was the first time we've done this. We started to just be on video and we decided to do live stream, so really special kudos to those who came out. As Maxwell mentioned, we are privileged at Agency 3 to do work nationally. We even have some global work and most importantly, local right here in our backyard. So if you know a DC entrepreneur who lives in DC, and whose business is registered in DC, then please have them sign up for consideration for the next round of funding. The one thing that I would say to you that I try to always end with is that I do this work not because I want to, but I believe I have no other choice but to. I have 6 kids, and I would like to believe that at some point in time, one of them, their lives will be better for the work that we are all doing collectively. I leave you with this. As a finance person, I believe everything is about the numbers. But Robert Arnault, who is an amazing economist, said something one time in one of his books that struck me, and he said that the only thing that is profitable is being uncomfortable. That if you're comfortable, you're more than likely not profitable. And so I made this challenge before, and I'm going to make it again. That if we really truly believe in the future of what the American dream can be equitably, then it is time for some communities to get uncomfortable, and communities who have been historically marginalized to finally take the main stage, as they so rightly deserve, as they are the primary drivers of the economy. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for watching. Have a great holiday. And there's beverages up top. You know it's all about a good reception for me. Oh, wait, let me get this. Am I off at least? He's my mentor. He's the one that got me to come inside full time, and now I just finished doing some work with him in one house. He's a good brother. Yeah. Oh. Yes. Okay. They're trying to get us to do some stuff together. I was like, I need some news. Good.
Exactly. So this is the other thing. You were at AU for a minute.
I was, yeah. You know, back at Georgetown.
Yeah. So Kathy, we're both from Philly.
Okay.
Went to AU, refuses to leave. Like, what's experience? I
Right.
close enough to yeah, like DC. Well, no, so we this one I stayed and I'm at teams, and so her is coming out of
Do your thing. Do your thing. Do your thing. Yeah.
literally came down here
on
to
the
traffic
ranks.
was in
I know,
so
it's crazy.
but you know, it's,
We didn't know about the African summit. I was like, we should plan that.
she's